Okay, for histology today, we're going to talk about epithelium and answer the what questions. What is epithelium? What are the different classifications, functions, and locations of epithelium? And what are cilia and microvilli? Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Morton, and I'm the noted anatomist. So first thing is, what is epithelium? Well, epithelium is one of the four basic tissue types in the body, which is along with connective tissue, muscle, and nervous tissue, which are the other three. And epithelium, also known as epithelial tissue, form glands and lines the outside and inside of the body. So glands, so any glandular tissue in the body, like your liver and pancreas, there's your liver. If we take a little section, shing, all of those red things you see in there are epithelial cells. What about the pancreas? Shing, we take a picture of that. All those are epithelial cell. Epithelium forms glands and also is lining. It lines the inside of the body like the lumen of tubular organs. So there's our stomach. We take in section. We're going to blow up and take a little square. All of those cells are epithelial cells. That form the inside lining of the stomach and other tubular organs in the body, and also lines the outside cavities of the body. So if we, like in the thoracic cavity, if we take a look at this internal surface of, in blue, that's a serous membrane that lines the inside body cavities of your thorax and abdomen pelvic cavities. And also does a covering externally to the body, like your skin. So there's a skin, and that yellow arrow showing that's the epidermis, is the outside of your skin. Okay, and outside of organs. And so then orange, that's the outside lining of your lung, but also does your heart and other organs of the body. So epithelium consists of epithelial cells anchored to a basement membrane. So there are epithelial cells, and there is a basement membrane right there, and those epithelial cells are anchored, much like Legos, thunk, on that basement membrane. And epithelial cells and epithelial tissue have apical and basal surfaces. Apical surface means apical means towards the surface, and basal means towards the base. In other words, the part that's anchored to the basement membrane. Epithelial tissue has no extracellular matrix. So if you look in there, there's really no space or very little space between these epithelial cells, much like bricks that you see anchored together. And as a result, epithelial tissue is avascular, without vessels. And so to get vessels, you're going to need something. To get blood to the epithelial tissue, you're going to need loose connective tissue that are deep to the basement membrane. So there is a loose connective tissue, and within the loose connective tissue are capillaries. And the capillaries then are what's providing nutrients and gas exchange with the epithelial tissue. There is one that you can see in basically longitudinal section. Often what you're going to see is in cross section, like that one. All right, there's epithelium. So, basement membrane, no extracellular matrix. All right, so classifications of epithelium now. And so here are all the different types of epithelial tissue we're going to talk about. Now, as we go through this, to try to help make sense of the mumbo jumbo, the way the histologists name epithelial tissues, they say, all right, how many cell layers are there? And what is the shape of the cells? And are there any cell specializations, if any? And then we're going to add the word epithelium. So we're going to add 1, 2, 3, 4, shing, and that gives us the name of the epithelium. So keep that in mind as we go through each one of them. Let's start with simple squamous epithelium. So simple squamous epithelium gets its name because the word simple means one layer. And one layer of cells anchored to that brown basement membrane. Squamous gets its name because it means flat or scale-like, because the cells look like a frisbee. And there's the word epithelium. So let's add all that together. We get simple squamous epithelium, which is a bunch of one-layer flat cells. Now, simple squamous epithelium has the following functions. One is diffusion, and diffusion means where you get gas or water that can diffuse through that plasma membrane and basement membrane from a concentration gradient. Filtration is when fluid and solutes filter through openings between adjacent epithelial cells, like the holes in a colander. And then lubrication is when you've got two membranes that secrete fluid that are right on top of each other and that secrete a fluid and allow for this movement that you'll see in mesothelial lining of like serosal cavities, like your heart and lungs. That was our cat Ramses. Now, the locations of simple squamous epithelium are a number of places. One common place is the alveolus, where there's the simple squamous cells for gas exchange with the air and the blood. And then there's our glomerulus, where in part of your kidney where you've got flat cells. Hold on, I got to get my cat because he's making too much noise. So that's the parietal layer of cells in the glomerulus, and they're flat. And then you also have these flat cells that line blood vessels, those endothelial cells, which most pathologists don't like to call endothelial cells, simple squamous epithelium, but they look like it. All right, so let's do an example. Here's a hematoxylin and eosin, abbreviated H and E stain, of the renal corpuscle. It's basically taking a section of the kidney, and that picture we saw previously in here we have it in a very zoomed up picture. Now there is a nucleus. Now the reason why I know that's a nucleus is it's dark and purple. Hematoxylin and eosin stains nucleic acids dark and purple. So nuclei just go pah, and they pop out. So it's easy to see that purple dot. Now the problem is you can see the purple dot, you just can't see the fence. You can see the house, but not the fence. And what I mean by that is the nucleus, like the house, you can see, but the fence, the plasma membranes do not stain. So now you superimpose your knowledge around that nucleus like that. Is it really that big? I'm guessing. But you know that all epithelial cells are anchored to a basement membrane. So now we superimpose our basement membrane on top of that. And deep to all basement membranes are loose connective tissue in pink, because hematoxylin and eosin stains proteins pink. And that's why that loose connective tissue, which is basically collagenous protein, is stained pink. So every cell has a basal surface, which is anchored to the basement membrane, and the apical surface towards the surface. Okay? All right, there is simple squamous epithelium, its description, function, and location in a nutshell. Now let's go to simple cuboidal epithelium. Simple cuboidal epithelium here gets its name because the word simple means one layer anchored to the basement membrane. Cuboidal because the cells look cube-shaped, like a Rubik's Cube in a sheet that kind of looks like this. They're cube-shaped. And the nuclei are oval-shaped, as opposed to flat like a pancake and squamous. These are oval or round. And epithelium because there are a bunch of epithelial cells. So simple cuboidal epithelium right there. Its functions are absorption, which means something that the cell is absorbing into it, and secretion is something the cell is secreting out. And so the locations of simple cuboidal epithelium are as follows. Locations are as follows. Nephron is one of them, where you have these tubules where you have a lot of absorption of the filtrate. That happens one big location. Another one is basically glands, like the sweat gland. So there you have a long duct, which are secreting things into the duct. And so a lot of glandular, every time sweat glands, liver, pancreas, all those, you'll find cuboidal epithelium. And so here's a kidney. So we zoom in on that, and there is a nucleus. And so a nucleus. We know that's a cell because there's a nucleus, so we superimpose the fence, the plasma membrane, which there's always a basement membrane, so that means that deep to the basement membrane's loose connective tissue, which means that's the basal surface, and that's the apical surface, which is close to the lumen of this tube. This is a straw in cross-section. So there's simple cuboidal epithelium in a nutshell. Now let's talk about simple columnar epithelium. It gets its name because the word simple means one layer anchored to the brown basement membrane. Well, the basement membrane in this picture is brown. Columnar because these are tall, thin cells, much like a skyscraper. And so the nucleus is either thin and narrow or round and circular. Often you'll see it round and narrow. And then it's epithelial tissue because you got a bunch of cells together making epithelium. Now the functions are as follows. Absorption, which is something going into the cell. Secretion, something coming out of the cell. And another function is sometimes one of the cellular modifications is they have a thing called cilia. These projections, finger-like projections that stick up and move fluid across the apical surface of the tissue. And so in this more three-dimensional view, those are cilia. That's a ciliated version on the right, and there's no cilia of that tissue on the left. Now location, GI tract from the stomach to the anus is a big part. And then also in glands and airways and in the uterus and uterine tube. So here's the GI tract. So there is simple columnar cells with cilia. And here's the base of a gland, whereas often you see simple columnar at the base of the gland, simple cuboidal along the duct. All right, let's take a look at a H&E stain of one little section of the jejunum, part of our small intestine. There you can see a nucleus. So we superimpose the cell membrane around the outside of that nucleus. And so then you must be anchored to a basement membrane like that. And so deep to all basement membranes is loose connective tissue, which means that's the basal surface, and then that's the apical surface. And you're going to notice the brush border, the microvilli. I'll talk about brush border in a minute, on the apical surface. And that's where the food would be located and being absorbed into those simple columnar cells. There is simple cuboidal epithelium in a nutshell. Okay, so now let's talk about stratified squamous epithelium. And so stratified squamous epithelium gets its name because the word stratified means more than one layer. So there's more than one layer of cells, and only one layer of cells is anchored to the basement membrane and a bunch on top of it. Squamous, because it gets its name not because the basal cells, because those are cuboidal, it's because of the apical cells are squamous. So a stratified epithelium is often classified by the shape of the apical cells. And then you got a bunch of cells, so it's epithelium. That was rude of me yawning. Sorry, it's Saturday morning. I don't know what the deal is. Okay, stratified squamous epithelium functions. Well, they protect underlying tissue from abrasion. And so how does that work? Well, all of these cells here, their main purpose is to be sloughed off when that tissue comes up against something. For example, a good analogy is like an eraser. So when you rub an eraser, you're causing friction, and you got these little pieces of rubber that come off. The skin's the same way, as we get flakes of dust from your skin that come off all the time. Now, locations are twofold. One in the epidermis, and the other one's the esophagus and the vagina. Those are the main places. And so for the skin, this is showing the esophagus, okay? And so keratinized, when you add keratin to this, keratin is a very tough protein. It's the same type of protein classification you get in your fingernails and in your hair. And keratin in the epidermis helps to protect the water. And you'll notice that there's no nuclei. That's how you tell keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. The apical cells have no nuclei. Whereas in the esophagus and vagina, it's non-keratinized. You don't have the keratin, but you see nuclei, and that's how you can tell the difference when you're looking under a microscope. So let's look at stratified squamous keratinized epithelium in the epidermis. So there is a whole bunch of layers of cells. Look at those layers of cells. There's probably about 50 layers of cells there. And so that means that all these cells, the bottom layer is anchored to that basement membrane that we just drew on. And if that's the basement membrane, then deep to the basement membrane is loose connective tissue, because that's how you get blood to supply this stratified epithelium. And the part of the bottom layer of cells they call the basal cells, and the top layer of cells are the apical cells. But let's take a little square of this basal cells and go bing and blow it up, and you'll notice that those basal cells have nuclei. Now let's take a look at the apical cells and do a little section and blow that up. You notice that those apical cells have no nuclei. You notice how it's almost like scraping off? That's like the eraser. Okay. Oh, and that's the outside environment, okay? Now, that's stratified squamous epithelium overview. We move on to transitional or urinary epithelium. So urinary transitional epithelium is here. There's more than one layer of epithelial cells, so it's a stratified epithelium. We just don't call it that because the only place you find it is in the urinary system. And those very apical layers are dome-shaped, just as it shows there. And its function is it permits stretching and distension of the urinary system. Empty bladder, full bladder, empty bladder, full bladder. Beginning of the movie, end of the movie. And so the locations are basically urinary system. The ureter, the bladder, and the proximal urethral. Distal urethra will be stratified squamous. So here we have a section of the bladder, okay? And there is our basement membrane that we just drew on. And so one of the things I'll mention now is that epithelial tissue, remember how I said that it's like that there's no extracellular matrix? They're bricks. They're right together. Where loose connective tissue, there's space between those cells. So epithelial tissue basically does not practice social distancing. Connective tissue does practice social distancing. So there we've got multiple layer of these cells, and those epithelial cells are close together. Now, how do you know they're the cells? Well, all those purple dots represent nuclei. And those nuclei beside each other, even though you don't see the plasma membrane barriers between each adjacent cell, you superimpose that knowledge. So deep to all basement membranes is loose connective tissue. So there's the basal layer of cells, there's the apical layer, and notice the apical layer of cells are dome-shaped. And that's where the urine would be in this. So there is urinary or transitional epithelium in a nutshell. So let's talk about pseudostratified, ciliated columnar epithelium. Whoa, that's a mouthful. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium shown here gets its name because the word pseudostratified, what does that mean? Well, there's a cell, and there's a cell, and there's a cell. They kind of look like some cells are on top of each other, just like here, here, and here. It looks like those cells are kind of crowding each other. But what we notice is that it looks like more than one layer of cells, but every cell is actually anchored to the basement membrane. So histologists said, we're going to call it falsely stratified because it looks stratified, but it's not. So that term pseudo, like pseudoscience, false science, pseudostratified is falsely stratified. All the cells are anchored to the basement membrane, but they look like they're layered. Ciliated because there is this the cilia project from it, and then columnar because the cells are tall and thin, and epithelium because you got a bunch of different cells here. Okay, and all those different cells make, even though you see various cells like green and brown and blue and purple cells, all those different cells, you add a bunch of cells together, what do you get? A tissue. Those are epithelial cells, and they make epithelium or epithelial tissue. Now, the function is secretion, mainly mucus, and propulsion by cilia. So there, these goblet cells secrete mucus, and then the cilia are going to then move the mucus on top. So those are the two functions, and I'll talk about both of those a little bit later. Now, locations is mostly the respiratory system, trachea and proximal bronchi. So let's take a section of the trachea, and we'll look at it. Now, this is why I actually prefer respiratory epithelium, but you see this really long name still in a lot of literature, primarily because I think science people and doctors like to use really big words. But respiratory epithelium is one that I like to use mostly. So here's the section of the trachea, and let's zoom in a little bit on it. And so there's where the basement membrane would be. How do I know that? Lots of purple dots above, fewer purple dots below. Really dark purple above, that line, pink down below. So H, hematoxylin stains nucleic acid, dark purple. Eosin stains proteins, pink down below. So there is our loose connective tissue below. And so there's the basal layer, and there's the apical layer of this respiratory epithelium. And so it looks like there's multiple layers of cells. So let's take a look at that cell, and then that cell, that cell, that cell, and that cell. It looks like they're all on top of each other, but each cell is actually anchored to the basement membrane, so it's not really stratified. It's pseudo-stratified. There's the cilia projecting, looks like grass at the top, and that's where the air would be in this trachea. All right, so there is pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, also known as respiratory epithelium, in an overview of its description, function, and location. Now let's talk about cilia and microvilli for a second. So cilia are located on the apical surface of anchored cells, and it moves liquid over the surface of the cells. So here is ciliated columnar cells, and there's the cilia projecting from the top, and there's a goblet cell, and goblet cells make mucus. And what does mucus do? It goes blue, and it then goes over. And then notice the cilia. See how the cilia are moving? The cilia are moving all of that mucus along the top. Well, cilia are kind of like what you see at a concert for crowd surfing, okay? So here's a concert, and you're like, hey, there's lots of people with arms sticking right up. Hey, look, there's lots of cells with cilia sticking right up. Hey, look, the person being transported on top by the crowd by their arms. Right? Woo, they're moving along. Hey, look, fluids being transported on top by the cells by cilia in a very similar way. No, I'm not saying people who go to concert and crowd surfs are like snot, but the analogy works. So here we have a section of respiratory epithelium, and there's ciliated columnar cells. And look, there's that cilia like grass projecting from the top. And there's a goblet cell that makes mucus. And you can tell it's a goblet cell there because it looks frothy in appearance. All right. Now, what about microvilli? Well, microvilli are also located on the apical surface of anchored cells, and by anchored cells, I mean to the basement membrane. And their purpose is to increase surface area for absorption. All right, so here is one epithelial cell, but there's no microvilli. So now let's look at the apical surface and then measure the surface area that could be responsible for absorption. So let's take that line and blow it up and then just go shing like that. That is the amount of surface area that cell could absorb stuff. Now let's look at a cell with microvilli. And now let's measure all of the length of those microvilli for their surface area for absorption. Bring that up. Now let's stretch that out. Shing! Look at that. The surface area for absorption is about 25 times the amount of area that is available for absorption. That really sounded like an infomercial. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I got a little excited there. So that surface area, there's 25 times more for each cell. And so when we take a look at this from the jejunum, look at every single cell as we go over this villus, is what it's called. Notice those microvilli. Holy cow, it totally increases surface area for absorption. And so there you can see the cell with microvilli, and plus the microvilli kind of look like Bart Simpson's head, don't they? All right, now there we have a nucleus. Okay, you see that nucleus right there, which then we superimpose our knowledge, and there's a cell. And so there is a drawn-in cell beside it, and there's the microvilli. Now we call it a brush border because those microvilli are so close together that it kind of looks fuzzy, almost like a hairbrush, and like the hairs from a hairbrush, and that's why they call it a brush border. That's what increases surface area for absorption. In this case, the jejunum, that's how you get your amino acids and simple sugars and fats absorbed from, well, leave fats out of that for a second, my apologies. That's how you get like your nutrients like amino acids and simple sugars absorbed into the cells. Let's do a little practice, shall we? So here what I want you to do is take a look. On the left-hand side is a bunch of the tissues we just covered in order. And the right-hand side in different and mixed up are a bunch of different tissues. I want you now to pause this video and to match them. And when you're ready to go, press play again. I'm going to continue. So there's simple squamous epithelium. It is because it's one layer of flat cells. That's Bowman's capsule from the glomerulus. And then simple cuboidal epithelium, that's one layer of cubed cells. And they're cubed because even though you can't see the actual cell, the nucleus is round. And then here is simple columnar cells. How can you tell? Well, one layer of cells and the nuclei are tall and thin. That's the jejunum. And then there is pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. It looks stratified, but it's not. And one of the things is the cilia projecting at the top. Help me know that's respiratory epithelium. There is stratified squamous keratinized epithelium because there's more than one layer of cells. The top layer of cells are flat and there's no nuclei. And then here is stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium because there's more than one layer, and the top horizontal arrow is showing a nucleus, which means you can see the nuclei, so it's non-keratinized. And so that, my friends, is epithelium in a nutshell.